Our next speaker is Dr. Philip Moller, SJ. Now, Dr. Moller is a JRF in philosophical theology at Campion Hall, working at the intersections of philosophy and modern theology, especially as these arise in the context of contemporary society. He is particularly interested in the arenas of natural theology, metaphysics, epistemology, and human knowledge of God, philosophical and theological anthropology, modern Catholic thought, and the nature and method of Christian theology, and religious belief, law, and public policy. So the Ressourcement project and methodology of the French Jesuits, especially Henri de Lubac, are central to his research. And it was because of this work on de Lubac that I asked Philip to address a specific topic, which to my sheer delight, he has done, namely human experience in the study of religion, phenomenology, verticality, and the natural desire to see God. So I very much look forward to hearing your lecture, Philip, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Gavin, for your very warm welcome, and good morning to everybody here. Look, I must admit to you that when I first read Professor Flood's introduction to this long and very deep conference program, I was filled with a certain trepidation. Now, trepidation because it's broadly suggested in the discipline of phenomenology that you will have seen in the introduction, that this discipline of phenomenology has been lassoed in a certain way by inveigling theologians. And I am indeed, as Gavin has just read out, one of those theologians who might cometh like a thief in the night to raid the treasures of phenomenology, or perhaps even you might say to poison the well. But is it too presumptuous to suggest, and gently of course, that the tools of theological reflection might be pressed into service in a manner which is constructive for the fields of religious studies and of philosophy more broadly? That is to suggest that there are some features of the theological tradition, such as the double beatitude or happiness of the human person, which are difficult for us to read as anything other than proposals for a philosophical life, the vita philosophica. That's where I'm going to attempt to press. So today my paper is going to take the form more of a mapping exercise rather than an attempt at novelty or some fabulous discovery, and I hope you'll excuse me for that. This because Gavin has just said he invited me kindly to consider what might be called the verticality of religious experience and its possible appearance to phenomenology. And in fact, to consider this in order to add some explanatory power to the field of religious study. So this is indeed an interdisciplinary attempt this morning. And I'm specifically encouraged, therefore, to introduce a strange notion from Western Catholic theology, known as the natural desire for the beatific vision, or the natural desire to see God, which might then be seen in phenomenological terms to make present a certain givenness, a limited givenness of experience on the vertical rather than the horizontal plane. Now, the caveats. As a philosophical theologian straying a little outside my territory, I have had to go away and do my homework, and that's a good thing. I've been very much taken with a strand in religious studies literature that makes, it seems to me, a rather bold claim, one that I'm attracted to, that it is possible to hold that a religious or a vertical experience is a sphere of evidence, which is opened up by a givenness that is vertical. That is, such verticality goes beyond, but is no less genuine than the horizontal realm of experience, which may be said in principle to be within our grasp. And so that's a fairly significant thing that I have come to appreciate. And I was pleased to see that Anthony Steinbock, from whom we will hear later today, is a major advocate of this position. And several other senior scholars have followed him in recent years in this territory of religious studies. And they point to the religious experience of mystics in the Abrahamic traditions in particular. And that was quite compelling, I found. And Steinbock in particular holds that each of these mystics give an account of reality which permits a description of the basic structure of a mystical experience. And these experiences, it is argued, have an evidential character. This is a strange word for theologians, but it's very important, I think, for us that he says that these have an evidential character and that any particular epiphany that might be received has a certain givenness to it. Perhaps I can quote, "It is a very special order of human experience that has its own manner of evidence, of illusion, of deception, fulfillment, powers of discernment, clarity, murkiness, and so forth." And so I think we can say that these are descriptions of the givenness of the holy with, if you like, a capital H, which could be said to be the religious dimension of experience par excellence. We see this in Steinbock, but it comes up several times in literature in that strand following, which I found very important, I think. So what is helpful about this approach, at least, is that it tackles a significant boundary dispute head-on. Here, religious experience, interestingly, is not automatically ruled out on the basis of irrationality, madness, or even mental illness. It is not nonsense in an analytic sense. Rather, the religious experience of mystics is capable of being parsed according to an emotional sphere which has its own integrity and even surmounts the order of reason. That's an interesting claim to which I'll return. It encompasses sentiments or emotions such as kindness or hatred, for example. Thus, if we stand back, we see an attempt to grasp a plane of actuality which is irreducible to the usual presentation on the horizontal plane. As such, this is an argument which challenges phenomenology to go beyond its own circumscribed limits to acknowledge that horizontal presentation does not exhaust experience, to recognize that horizontal presentation is likely only one mode of givenness, essential, of course, but which is nevertheless distinguished from a vertical givenness. So in this way, there is room for us to argue that although when it comes to religion, religious experience, and indeed experience of the holy with a capital H, these do not resemble the givenness of presentation, and that is fine. But they are nevertheless given according to their own logic, and that experience is admissible. So putting things at their highest, it is even said that this vertical givenness might be said to take the status of evidence, a religious evidence which is possessed of a vertical structure. And this, of course, must be, I repeat, taken on its own terms and not subordinated to how objects are given to us in perception or evaluated according to given narrow-mindedness of philosophy or accepted or rejected according to the presuppositions of religious belief. And so there is, putting a philosopher's hat on, some sort of warrant is claimed for recognizing the givenness of religious experience. So that's the literature. But I'd like to ask this morning, is it really legitimate or even accurate to use the term evidence to identify the givenness of one person's reported experience of God? Indeed, from perspective of phenomenology and indeed philosophy in particular, theology in particular, does the term experience of God make any sense at all? At the very least, for the theologians in the room or on the call, I can see red flags being waved. All this talk of experience of God is veering very close to the territory of idolatry. For theologians, contrary to the charges laid against us, I think one must be very careful not to reduce theology to philosophical anthropology, because that in turn has a reductive effect upon, on our side, the doctrine of God, and presumes upon the contentful mystery. And of course, this in turn also would inevitably reduce, truncate, or thin out what we understand to be the human person fully alive in theological terms. But referring to the human experience of God, at least in the Christian religion, nevertheless does have a long tradition in the churches. We know the significance of Schleiermacher's On Religion speeches to its cultured despisers from 1799, especially here in this university in Oxford, because it led an evangelical Christian belief population to understand their experience of God according to the movement of their feelings, which itself, as you would say, is a fairly restrictive category. And quite apart from the mystics, elements of the Catholic tradition too have placed significant reliance not on feeling, but on the category of experience more broadly. Take, for example, the movement of the discernment of spirits in Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises, for which the Dominicans locked him up not once but twice, and also the methodology of the so-called modernist crisis at the end of the 19th century, involving such characters as Maurice Blondel or Alfred Doisy. There, the category of experience in the human person was invoked to combat the rationalism, the abstraction, and the extrinsicism of the so-called late 19th century neo-Thomist commentators in the Roman Catholic world, those who tried to beat the Enlightenment at its own game, as you would know. Now, Karl Barth, as we know, was implacably opposed to this in either its liberal Protestant or Catholic modernist forms. In his lectures from the early 20s, and I'm grateful to Kevin Hart for pointing this out over the usual epistle to the Romans, Barth formulated his objection very precisely and quite categorically, much like his 9 to natural theology and any philosophical grounding of theology. So there Barth said, the bad thing about the modern theology of experience is that it builds its certainty about God upon something that is given in the human subject, when the only thing that is given in this subject, even in the believer, is the question. Yet this is nothing like a blanket or a uniform Reformed Protestant position. Barth's student and colleague Ebhard Jungel, who in fact died just last week, does not reject human experience as a category, even though he does reject the philosophical grounding of theology. Rather, he takes experience seriously to the extent that he says it needs to be examined against a backcloth, if you will, of non-being. And when one considers non-being and then considers our experience over against that non-being, he says that we end up acknowledging for ourselves, and gratefully so, that our experience, that which we have come from nothingness, and that we are grateful to be kept in being. So really this is an experience of consciousness, is an event that cannot be deduced from previous episodes in our lives. And so for Jungel, this is a kind of revelation, really. And so I find that quite interesting. So at the very least, from both ends of the ecclesiological spectrum in terms of theology, and I will leave that quite soon, the Protestants, Barth and Jungel on the one end, and the Catholics, mystics like Ignatius and philosophers like Blondel on the other end, can agree that our experience can give it rise at least to the important question of God. So we have a question before we have any experience. And many mystics and mystical theologians would rightly venture a little further to say that any sort of experience of God, and one as small as the fleeting conscious awareness of a presence or a trace or a vestige, presents first as a question. Yet the moment that we entertain any sort of question about God, however inchoate or unformulated, then we are already set out on a spiritual journey. And this is where I would like to introduce the principal figure in my story today, a French Jesuit, as Gavin has pointed out, from the 20th century by the name of Henri de Lubac, who traversed the disciplines of fundamental theology, mystical theology, worked in philosophy, but even worked in the studies of religion, having written quite an incisive and lasting book on Amida Buddhism, a little outdated today, but quite relevant when he wrote it in the 1950s. Here, de Lubac will underscore that any experience of God, even the merest intimation of the divine, does not necessarily depend or turn upon coming up with positive knowledge. Indeed, quite paradoxically, this process of the coming to experience of God will ordinarily begin, though not always, with negative knowledge. Now, what does this mean? Because now we are quite a long way away from the bald givenness with which we began today. Well, most basically, there is in the Western tradition, the Western theological tradition, in the Catholic vein, an understanding which has passed along from generation to generation, and which developed from the thought of St. Augustine, and which has complexified and thickened, if you will, over the centuries. It was overlooked in the tradition by total separation of the faculties of theology and philosophy during the High Baroque scholasticism, and was not recovered until de Lubac ventilated the question as late as the 1930s and 1940s. And this theological principle, as I said at the beginning, is known as the natural desire for the beatific vision. It holds that the human person within himself or herself, whether they are conscious or not, has a desire for an end or a goal or a telos that is not natural, but is in fact supernatural. That is, in the terms that we are discussing, there is a philosophical anthropology which attends this theological principle. They are not univocal, they are not the same thing, but one attends the other. And it expresses that every human person that experiences a restlessness and a desire, and the root cause of that restlessness is that we are made not for this world or the earth, but to have a knowledge of the divine in God's nature, not our nature. Perhaps now you can see the parallel with verticality. This open desiring of human nature is oriented not horizontally but vertically. It is said that we experience a restlessness in this life that leaves us both dissatisfied and wanting more. And this experience of restlessness leads many people to look beyond this worldliness, the horizontal of religious studies, if you like, to consider the vertical plane, which is also the spiritual. So now, having said that, if you are wondering why I am talking about theology and de Lubac's natural desire for the supernatural, and if you think, and maybe quite rightly, that I am making a category mistake by introducing and even tainting phenomenology, consider this. One of the prominent phenomenologists of the 20th century who is still living, someone whom Kevin Hart referred to several times yesterday, is Jean-Yves Lacoste. Now, in the foreword to his seminal phenomenological text of 1994, Expérience et l'absolu, Experience and the Absolute, Lacoste writes this: finally, this book, or in the end, this book is dedicated to a recently departed friend, whose exquisite courteousness never impaired his critical faculty, and who I'm sure would not have done me the disservice of sparing me his objections. My simple hope is that he would have discovered here what he taught me. And in the front of this book, his inscription reads, to Henri de Lubac. So de Lubac's recovered principle of the natural desire for the supernatural figures right through Lacoste's own thought form, in which Lacoste parses this theological principle in his own phenomenological terms. He seeks the givenness of this necessity in the phenomenological attitude, rather than, say, the theological or the natural attitude. And in the following year, Lacoste published an article entitled Le désir de l'inexigible, preambles to a lecture, or desire and the ungraspable, preambles to a reading. And here Lacoste examples what de Lubac is doing with a natural desire to see God, and how exactly this theological principle may also be presented in phenomenological terms. In order to see how this might be possible, I'd like to take you through briefly de Lubac's argument, but as it appears in Lacoste's phenomenological presentation of it, which of course has significant debt to Heidegger, and is also something that de Lubac simply would not do. And I think that's why it's helpful for us to bridge the gap and not make these category mistakes between philosophy, theology, and religious studies. So the starting point for de Lubac and then for Lacoste is that our sense of the present, so our consciousness, hangs upon a future which is completely beyond our control. Yet our desire or desiring forbids all enclosure or containment of our being within the imminent teleologies of that future. Our present hangs upon that future. And so we have to ask, to what kind of experience must we return if one is to register in consciousness such a dependence on the future? How do we register that in our consciousness? This experience is desire, and desire is the word that de Lubac uses, but it is really only an approximation in the sense of the Latin desiderium. It's an inexact translation. Rather, we are exploring a wider sense, the sense of what the human person experiences always and everywhere as a paradox, a natural desire for a complete and total happiness or beatitude that we are not actually owed or that we are not due. We don't deserve it. A happiness or a beatitude in the full sense that we don't deserve on our own merits. This paradox proposes itself as the ultimate or the final truth of our being, and suggests that this truth can appear to our consciousness. Indeed, that there is no desire which can be thought of, it would seem, which is incapable of coming to consciousness. Now, this desire that we experience, it is said most certainly, is not merely an intention to desire. Notice this relation to intentionality. Indeed, its links with the profoundness of the affect of life, understood as love for self, or that affect experience towards others, permits us to know that this affect of life is indeed ambiguous and has a non-transparency. I am not the master of my own desires. I don't know truly what I desire in a certain respect. Instead, this desire actively desires within me, more than the I desire things for myself. And so we would have trouble identifying in this proliferation of all the different desires inside us a clear and distinct witness that could bring us definitively and all the way to the pure eschatological tension that is specified by the desiderium, this fullness of desire. As de Lubac says in The Mystery of the Supernatural, to quote, "It hardly matters in the actual circumstances of this existence, our existence, immersed as I am in the sensible things and unaware of myself, this desire may not be objectively perceived in all its truth and with all its force. Yet, it will be the case that I do so without fail on the day when my nature will appear to me, at last, as it is at its foundation." That is, while we can know that we desire the supernatural, the something more than what we have right now, we can only ever know this inchoately, and for good reason. As Lacoste says, in the conditions that being in the world dictate to experience, is it not the destiny of the desiderium to pass incognito, to pass specifically and clearly unknown? So then, what else may we look to in our quest for experience, for givenness of something more? A second phenomenon which shows itself comes through happiness, the beatitude part of the natural desire for the beatific vision, the beatitude bit. And Lacoste therefore puts this question to us. We as humans know that we are capable of happiness under the formalities of well-being, of serenity and so forth. But we might also discover simultaneously that in the exercise of this capacity, we are actually unable to bestow this happiness upon ourselves. We can't grant this beatitude to ourselves. We can't simply demand the happiness of this world. And so, therefore, he asks, and I ask, does this experience of happiness not have a reverse side? Does that not unfold within a certain necessity of experience of non-beatitude and of non-happiness? And this is the experience of the idea of the restlessness, l'inquiétude, with which we began to permit us to express. We can now express this and parse it in a different framework. Now, it's important to note that this restlessness does not make our earthly joys inauthentic. It does not prevent us from enjoying repose in the world, that happiness of the present. It does, however, signal to us, on the other hand, that the enclosure of joys in our present, in this present, of the present life of consciousness, is not practical other than by bracketing. It is a real saturation of the present life of consciousness in, say, the experience of joy. But one needs only to have lived in the experience of joy to know the very fragility of this saturation and the illusion which it brings to life for us. Any occasion of joy shows to us simultaneously how impotent we are to institute joy, to locate it in a perpetual tonality of our experience. And so we have this fragility of saturation, the reverse side of the experience of joy. This is what we have in the present. Now, beatitude itself, that is, beatitude, perfect beatitude, would be the perennial or the constant institution of joy. We would therefore only know happiness, but because joy in the present cannot cancel out the hold that the future exacts on the present, we can't durably or solidly be possessed of a joy that is without concern or worry-free in the present. In the present, no joy can abolish the conditions which bring about anxiety. No joy of being can abolish the claims or demands that nothingness exerts upon being. Even if we experience joy, around the corner we experience anxiety. Now comes the nub of the argument. On the one hand, there is the menace of anxiety in our lives which bears down upon every joy that we can experience. And on the other hand, there is the critical reflection, in a very French sense, that restlessness provokes in us. We know that we are restless. Anxiety, and then restlessness. These two things reveal to us quite solidly that the joy of the present is not a beatitude in the proper sense. We would be deceiving ourselves if we said that our present happiness in the world, on earth, was the same as an eternal beatitude. So anxiety tells us of the mundane inaccessibility of beatitude in this life, in a negative fashion. But then restlessness. Restlessness speaks of the condition which makes beatitude, permanent beatitude, still thinkable. Restlessness hangs the present upon the absolute future that we cannot give to ourselves, that we cannot lay claim to, that we cannot represent adequately to ourselves. But this experience of restlessness, which is not yet an experience of God, is the only thing that can put an end to the logic of instability which is in the world, the instability of joy, as I said before. And this includes the true joys of the person who tastes or enjoys a certain closeness to God in the here and now, if that person is a spiritual person. And so here we arrive again at a sort or a kind of archaeology of human desiring, to a hypostatic union of lacuna or wants, which solidly binds to a reason which is on a quest of its own, a quest for the highest knowability, and an affectivity which is on a quest for the highest love. Reason and affect, knowledge and love, which of course is Augustine. And so we must also say that the heart wants that which it cannot demand or claim, and hopes, therefore, leaving aside the notion that it is owed or due anything, any necessity, it seeks instead a gratuity or a gift. Faced with pure reason, the heart's desire seems irrationally insatiable. It wants clearly beyond what it what it can do, what it is clearly unfit for. But what about a different characterization of reason itself? Because if reason is on a quest for a higher knowability, one that is vertical, that is open to a later satisfaction, what about that kind of reason, in reason's knowledge of what it is not, of this exigency, coupled with the desire of the heart hypostatically, can this experience of weakness, can this knowledge of weakness bring to consciousness the need for a second gift? The need for a second gift of, if you like the spiritual, if you like grace, call it experience of God, of the other. De Lubac And Lacoste, in his own presentation, in his own phenomenological way, says yes. It is intuition rather than the concept that it is at work to begin with, but then that can develop. And this is the operation of the natural desire to see God, and it is fundamental to what it means to be human, and it is also completely rational. Now, by now we are very far from the fairly direct and slightly unrefined assertion about the givenness of personal experience of God via mystics with which we began. What theology offers to phenomenology, and in turn to religious studies, I want to suggest, is a delicacy which comes from method, from an interdisciplinary method. A method that does not offend any idolatry, any sensitivities about idolatry. And it does not claim to go so far as to provide evidence that an experience of God was had, per se. It doesn't rule it out, but it doesn't go that far. But it does supply a way to show that human experience, which is common to each of us, has a givenness on the vertical plane that is open and that is oriented to the sacred. In our restlessness, the human person is capax Dei in our terms, that the human person isn't open to a mystery, open to a supernatural, to a spirituality. And the rest, I would say, in our terms anyway, is the operation of grace, or the operation of the spiritual, which is well and truly into the territory of theology, so I shall trespass no more and stop. Thank you, Gavin.